So we're back. Yeah, I know.
Sorry, did we totally digress from your plan?
How are you enjoying this roller coaster ride?
Actually, a lot. Even though it's painful for all of us to hear, I think it's really important. You know how you're characterizing. You know what is happening in terms of 1%, the 1%, the 10%, and also the in a way the locus of power in our technological era. You know, but I want to get back to the question that you brought up, and that has to do with the victim narrative and, you know, how to actually transform that. I'm curious, you know, as two storytellers, you know, how you see transforming that narrative, because it is, you know, depotentiating possibilities that are really generative in terms of the future.
One thing that's been so striking to me, I've done a lot of feminist work, mostly about violence against women. We often tell a victim narrative where once you're a victim, that's all you are. Once you're broken, you just lie around in shards. This idea that you're somehow destroyed. But a high percentage of the women I know have been raped or abused or sexually assaulted. And they're scientists, they're organizers, they're writers, they're mothers, they're doing absolutely brilliant work. And so I don't want to say people aren't victims, because a lot of us have suffered horribly, but that something terrible happening to you doesn't have to strip away your agency, your genius, your strength, your capacity. One of the things I love about your work, and I think it's partly just sort of a different generation from you know, that you have that great toughness, which is, you know, brings you to talk about post-traumatic growth, about the, you know, we both love kintsugi, the Japanese art of repair, where it's not that we're going to pretend the bowl never broke. We're going to celebrate that after it broke, it became something even more beautiful by gluing it back together with golden glue. So it has these seams of gold.
Celebrate the crack. Yeah,
and I think all of us in some way have suffered, all of us are broken. That's something else Buddhism can remind us of. I think there's a fiction that there's somebody to whom nothing bad has happened, which is basically a person who's lived in bubble wrap their whole fucking life, which seems sort of boring to me. And so I don't want to strip away the victim narrative and not recognizing, you know, brutality around racism or around gender, around trans and queer phobia, around poverty, around environmental harm. But I do want to say we can look at people over and over to whom terrible things have happened, and they are not necessarily weak, they are not necessarily passive, their lives are not over because these things happen to them. They continue, and sometimes they do remarkable things, and I think that possibility remains for almost everybody. And there are people whose trauma overwhelms them, but there are also people who came out of Auschwitz, like Viktor Frankl, people who came out of horrific child abuse. I was just listening to Mary Oliver talking about her horrific childhood. Virginia Woolf was molested as a child. It might have contributed to her mental illness. It might have contributed to her being one of the most brilliant and original writers of the 20th century. So it doesn't, James Baldwin suffered terribly from a fundamentalist authoritarian father and from being gay in a time when that was so repressed and punished, but it didn't stop him from being one of the great voices of the second half of the 20th century. So I just want I don't want a victim narrative that says something bad happened to you, now you stop. I do want room for people to acknowledge their suffering and to acknowledge that that's not all they are.
So this conversation began with the truth of suffering,
Yes.
your story and your story.
Yes.
And I think that, it's in a way full circle on that particular theme, that actually your grief and, your suffering and your family system provided in a certain way the grist for the mill for you to actually take action in a world at a scale, actually, that is not inconsequential. But even at an intimate scale, at the individual level, what you both are examples of, and that I think what we're pointing to is that the compassion is really generated out of the experience of not separating yourself from the truth of suffering and not in denial, and also not taking, being in the grip of the victim narrative where it's disabling instead of generative.
I wonder if part of it comes from an idea that I think is very popular in white America, that we're supposed to be happy all the time, and nothing bad is supposed to happen, etc. That there are all these myths of, like, having it all, being completely happy, being worry-free, etc. That doesn't acknowledge that life is mostly kind of difficult and magical, surprising, amazing, full of things to love and wonder at, but also absolutely harrowing and overwhelming a lot of the time. And it will, and that, the alternative to risk is not venturing out, not living.
Yeah.
And, the alternative that to avoid loss is often to avoid life altogether. And so there is this sense also of suffering as failure in this culture. When Buddhism, I think, has been a wonderful corrective for more and more people in the West, which is like, hell yeah, they're suffering. Now let's do some things with it.
So I have thought of myself and experienced myself as a victim for most of my life. First, when I was growing up, I felt very deeply that I was the victim of a very abusive mother. Then I went to the next chapter of that and felt I am a victim of my former husband, and I can add to that. And what has been very helpful to me to get out of that, because there is a choice that has to be made. Do I choose to continue to think about myself as a victim, either of my personal circumstances or of global circumstances or because of my boss or whoever? But there is a choice. And the real aha for me was the Buddha's teaching of the 2 arrows. That to me was such an aha, because
you should share that
yes,
teaching.
as you say, Rebecca, life happens, right? Shit hits the fan. And that's the first arrow, because we're all subject to things that happen that are not peaches and cream. And we're all in suffering mode, I don't know if constantly, but frequently. The question then is, do you stay with that arrow only and choose then what to do constructively about that? Or do you produce your own second arrow and wound yourself constantly, 1 and 2nd time and 3rd and 4th time? And it is that second arrow of self-wounding that is the most pernicious. It is not what happens to us in life. It is our story, or our lack of choice, our lack of freedom to choose a different reaction to what happens, that makes the difference between a life that, of course, deals with all of the challenges and is then also a generative life, or an experience that is only degenerative. But it's a choice. Do I produce the second arrow, right? Or do I actually go out with a very different, with more compassion, with more sense of, I can feel the pain of a woman who was raped. I can feel the pain of a woman who was abused. I can feel the pain. I mean, there's an incredible gift in that, because an experience that I have not had as a human is very difficult for me to feel that pain in someone else. Whereas if I have had that experience, now I know. Now I can walk in your shoes. And so there's a huge gift. And then what do we do? Do we cause a second arrow or not? Where I am...
I need to interrupt, because actually, I have a concern about some of what you're saying. And that is, it's... We, the 3 of us and many, enjoy a certain kind of privilege through education, through the color of our skin, through our life experience and so forth. And, when you're, for example, in the Himalayas in certain areas, and you realize the notion that you have a choice is not even in their vocabulary.
That you have a choice around what, Roshi?
You know, choosing, say, a path forward that is characterized by hope or faith or by a sense of generativity or possibility. And, or, again, going back to my experience of working in the prison system, on death row and maximum security, and encountering, many individuals who have lost hope. They've lost any sense of a future. They've lost faith in anything. And the notion of there being a choice for, some of the people that I worked with in that setting is just so far from their world.
It is far from their world, but it doesn't mean, Roshi, that it is impossible.
No, I don't say it's not possible.
Because, if it is impossible, then we live in post-traumatic syndrome eternally.
Right.
And that's the piece that, I'm trying to figure out, how do we get out of that? How do we get out? Because we've all had traumas, some much deeper than others. But is permanent post-traumatic syndrome completely inevitable?
Well, you talk about post-traumatic growth, and I just want to throw out two people who came to mind when you were speaking, one of whom you spent time with, a wonderful young nursing student we met who was fatherless, growing up in one of the poorest, highest villages in the world, sent out at age 5 to be a goat herd, ran away to school at age 8 and fought her way to an education. And we helped her come to the U.S. She just graduated from nursing school in
Master
New York.
of Public Health.
That's a different one. No?
Okay, yeah,
Yes,
that's right.
that's a different one.
That's yours. That's the one you
I'm not
have.
mentioning this person's name because there might have been like little immigration complication. Another person is my friend Jarvis Masters, a renowned Buddhist practitioner on death row who constantly embarrasses and awes me because in the worst circumstances in the world, was falsely sentenced to death in California, which will probably not execute more people, but the sword hangs over you. He spent the last 35 years of his life in a small cage, treated horrifically. And through, I think, a greatness of spirit he had before Melody Chavez brought Buddhism to him, he somehow, to use Ruth Gilmore, the great anti-prison geographer's term, self-emancipated. He built a life outside the prison walls. He wrote books. He built friendships. He took the precepts from, I don't know if we call them the precepts from a Tibetan Buddhist.
Yeah, Chaltu Tuka Rinpoche.
Yeah, and stuff like that. So we are totally privileged. We have had lives with far more choices than most people. But I've also been awed to see people in these tough circumstances, often because the alternative is to accept a completely horrific life, seize what opportunity comes their way and see themselves as people of agency. I think also of the Pacific Climate Warriors, who are the climate activists associated with 350.org in the South Pacific, where many of them face the erasure of their nations by sea level rise, and their wonderful motto, we're not drowning, we're fighting, because they found a lot of people in the global north or patronizingly treating them as doomed peoples. And so Fenton Lutuna Tabua, I think, who's a native Fijian, coined that wonderful motto, which I think is very connected to my own sense of hope, which is like, we will not surrender before it's absolutely necessary, and actually we won't afterwards either, and so we're not drowning, we're fighting. And I see that spirit often among the desperate. I saw that among the Zapatistas. I see that among the coalition of Immokalee farm workers in Florida fighting for, mostly undocumented, fighting for their rights and beating the biggest corporations in the United States. I often see people really pushed to the wall. It's like, I just surrender to a life of horror or I fight back. And I think surrender is a lot easier when you're essentially surrendering to a life of comfortable meaninglessness, which is what cynicism, doomism, etc. get a lot of us rich white people. You basically get to lounge around and eat junk food and watch binge watch whatever or something rather than, going out and getting arrested or writing your senator or whatever the hell belief might compel you to do. So I just want to throw that into the mix.
Yeah, I think we're totally on the same page.
We agree about everything, but there are wrinkles.
But, for me, the wrinkle is, I think about Nelson Mandela, for example, or Malala. I think about Jane Goodall, in this really this world of extraordinary individuals who, encountered varying degrees of extreme and less extreme resistance. But I also, I keep turning toward those who experience themselves as deeply disenfranchised.
Yes.
And, I just cannot turn away from those communities, those individuals. And, my own curiosity, and I say that word, it doesn't sound respectful enough. It's curiosity that is characterized by deep concern. Is, when you're, as so many young people are experiencing today, there are young people who are just doing incredible work in relation to the climate issue that we are, the three of us are focused on. But there are at least as many, if not more, young people who feel, there is no future.
Well, so that takes what you're concerned one step farther, because the way I think about those young people is they're experiencing pre-traumatic syndrome. Because they have, first let's accept that trauma has all of a sudden become the
flavor du jour.
Yes, the flavor of the year or the month or something.
Yeah, really.
Everybody, there is this competition almost now, which is your trauma, and who has the deepest trauma. And as though that were the end of the path, and therefore you stay there forever. Where I totally take on your concern and take it farther, Roshi, is in so many young people that I encounter who are not in post-traumatic syndrome, but in pre-traumatic syndrome, because they take the projections of science that are projections, a linear line from where we are now to where we could be in the future, as though that scenario that science paints for 2050 or for 2100 is inevitable. That's not what science is saying. Science is just saying, look, if you continue business as usual, this is where you can be. But there is another road. But so many young people, and not so young people, take those scenarios of the future as the only possible outcome. And therefore, they're already in pre-traumatic syndrome because they feel they don't have any agency about it. This is it. They're cursed. They're doomed. Which comes back to your point, Rebecca, about actually that's not true. The future that we're going to have is being written right now. And that is where we need to take our decision, make our choice about how do we want to impact that future. It's not that the future is already written and therefore we give up and we start grieving already today. We grieve for what we have lost and we take everything to write today the future that we want.
Exactly. The Wobblies used to say, don't mourn, organize. And I keep saying we can mourn and organize.
Thank you.
Yes,
and,
exactly.
But what's interesting to me is I see a lot of people who are most marginalized are most refused to give up. And you look at Nelson Mandela, who was supposed to spend his entire life in prison, and a lot of people would have given way to absolute despair and been fully justified and withdrawn.
And anger.
What?
And anger. And vengeance.
Yeah, and he, I think, just did not assume he knew how the story ended. And the story ended with the end of apartheid in South Africa, him becoming president. Obviously, South Africa, the transition was not perfect. Economic justice was not realized. It's not a perfect country now. Mandela was not even a perfect human being. But it's an amazing story. It's one of the ones that really influenced me. It also happens around the same time as the collapse of the East Bloc and the Soviet Union. And that's one of the things that makes me who I am, is that things that were supposed to be impossible in all the best and worst ways happen all the time. There's a passage by Moses Maimonides, whose name I just mispronounced, I will note, because I never get these things right, who talks about pursuing the possible rather than the probable. And people believe so strongly in the probable. I lost my mind, my stomach in 2016, my stomach hurt for the entire month of October because Hillary Clinton was given an 85% chance of winning, which everyone decided was a 100% chance. It was probable she would win. And it's like, we fucking live in the 15% odds about 15% of the time. Did you know that? And then Donald Trump did not win the majority of the vote. I'm not sure he even really won. He did not win a free and fair election, but he won. And people were shocked. People really expect a predictable and probable world, and that's not what history tells us.
Certainty. Did we just talk about certainty?
And then we're looping back to engaging with uncertainty as being ready to meet what arises, which I think is, again, something Buddhism
and
tells us.
taking nothing for granted.
Nothing for granted.
Including good friends.
Yeah.
And good conversations.
That too. So I think this is perfect moment for a break.
Good.
Wow.